Where emotional self-harm really comes from. Part 1, we talk about self-harm as if it only exists on skin and bone-visible wounds, hospital visits, the scars we can point to. But there's another kind of damage that's quieter, more pervasive, and far more common: emotional self-harm. It doesn't announce itself with bandages. It shows up as a pattern of thoughts, habits, and decisions that chip away at your well-being over months and years. If you've ever found yourself replaying the same cruel script, "I'm not good enough. I don't deserve this. I'm always the problem," then you've met this shadow. In this first part, we're going to trace its origins. Where does emotional self-harm come from? Why does it feel so natural to hurt ourselves from the inside out? At its root, emotional self-harm is learned. It rarely appears out of nowhere. Imagine a child growing up in a household where love feels conditional. Praise arrives only when grades are perfect, affection is withheld after a mistake, or emotional needs are dismissed as dramatic. That child learns a simple rule: feelings are inconvenient, vulnerability is risky, and worthiness depends on performance. Those early lessons don't disappear when we become adults. They scaffold a worldview where self-worth is transactional and feelings are liabilities to be managed, hidden, or punished. Attachment patterns matter here. Developmental psychologists have shown that the emotional bond we form with caregivers shapes our inner voice. Secure attachment tends to produce an inner climate of safety when things go wrong. The internal response is, "I can get help, I'm seen." But insecure attachment, whether anxious or avoidant, creates an inner narrative of doubt or self-sufficiency that can morph into self-criticism. If your caregivers responded to needs with anger, indifference, or unpredictability, your nervous system learned to protect itself by minimizing need or by hypervigilance. That protection can later turn inward as self-blame and emotional punishment. Trauma is another powerful factory of emotional self-harm. Not all trauma looks dramatic. Repeated micro-traumas, constant criticism, chronic neglect, the tension of a household where mood swings were the norm accumulate. Each event leaves a residue, a belief, a sensation, a flash of memory. Without processing, those residues become interior weather patterns. A single offhand comment at age 7 doesn't to remain offhand when it becomes a filter for every new experience. It becomes the voice that whispers, "You're unlovable," and that whisper grows louder every time you're stressed, lonely, or afraid. Cultural and social messages compound the problem. We live in cultures that prize productivity, stoicism, and image. There's 1,000 little messages telling us to perform, to grind, to smile on command. Social media exaggerates that pressure. It offers curated lives as the baseline, not the highlight. When your daily experience doesn't match the feed, the instinct is often self-flagellation. If my life isn't picture perfect, there's something wrong with me. That comparison breeds a self-directed punishment, a steady erosion of self-compassion. Perfectionism and rigid standards are siblings of emotional self-harm. Perfectionism is not a harmless drive for excellence. It's a relationship with flaw that demands eradication. When you measure your worth by never failing, you build a system where any mistake must be met with internal condemnation. Instead of learning from error, you rehearse humiliation. The internal monologue becomes punitive. "You should have known better. You failed, therefore you are lesser." Over time, that monologue becomes automatic and punishment feels deserved, so you keep it in place. There's also a moral dimension: guilt and shame. Shame is the belief that something is fundamentally wrong with you, not that you did something wrong. It's a corrosive identity claim: "I am bad." Shame often springs from messages we internalize early on, that our desires were selfish, our needs burdensome, or our emotions unacceptable. Once shame takes hold, it becomes both cause and effect of emotional self-harm. We punish ourselves because we believe we deserve punishment. The punishment then confirms the belief. Let's not forget agency, how we learn to cope. If prosocial coping was not modeled, if no one showed you how to ask for help, set a boundary, or talk about pain, then self-harm can become an adaptive strategy. It's cruel, but predictable. When you feel bad, you either numb, dissociate, ruminate, or attack yourself. These are strategies that might have worked momentarily silencing a child to survive an environment, but in adulthood they become maladaptive rituals, repeated because they're familiar and because we don't know healthier alternatives. Finally, there is the neurobiology. Chronic stress rewires the brain. The amygdala becomes primed for threat. The prefrontal cortex, our rational manager, loses some of its regulatory power, and feedback loops reinforce negative thinking. Emotional self-harm is not just moral failing. It's a pattern embedded in wiring, hormones, and conditioned responses. Understanding that fact is important because it removes moral blame and opens the door to treatment and change. So, if you find yourself trapped in cycles of self-criticism, withdrawal, or self-sabotage, know this. The origins are multiple, and most are not your fault. They come from childhood lessons, attachment wounds, unprocessed trauma, cultural pressures, perfectionism, shame, learned coping, and stress-altered neurobiology. Recognizing that complexity is the first liberating step. It reframes the problem from "I am broken" to "I have patterns" that were built for a different time and purpose, and they can be changed. Where emotional self-harm really comes from. Part 2, if we look closely, emotional self-harm doesn't just appear out of thin air. It grows silently, often beginning in childhood. Imagine being a child who craves affection but only receives approval when they perform well. Maybe love came in conditional doses, praise for achievements, silence for mistakes. That child learns something dangerous. I am only valuable when I please others. Over time, this message carves into the subconscious, shaping a voice that whispers, "You are never enough." This early conditioning sets the stage for adulthood. What starts as innocent attempts to earn love and validation can twist into chronic self-criticism. The brain, like a sponge, soaks up these patterns, and they become default responses. That's why many people, even as adults, feel compelled to tear themselves down before anyone else gets the chance. It feels safer to criticize yourself than to risk rejection from someone else. Emotional self-harm becomes a shield, a painful one, but a shield nonetheless. But childhood isn't the only root. Society itself amplifies the cycle. We live in a culture that thrives on comparison. Social media feeds us highlight reels of other people's lives, and we measure ourselves against them relentlessly. We scroll through perfect images and polished achievements, then silently cut ourselves apart for not measuring up. "Look at them," the mind whispers. "You'll never be that good, that beautiful, that successful." What we forget is that these comparisons are illusions, curated moments designed to impress. But the damage still lands deeply, feeding the cycle of self-inflicted wounds. And then there's shame. Shame is the fuel that keeps emotional self-harm burning. Guilt says, "I did something wrong." Shame says, "I am something wrong." Where shame takes root, it convinces us that we are fundamentally flawed, undeserving of love or kindness. And so we punish ourselves, sometimes quietly through self-criticism, sometimes more visibly through destructive choices. In both cases, the intention is the same: to confirm what shame already believes, that we are broken. Relationships also play a key role. If you've ever stayed in a toxic partnership, you know how easy it is to confuse pain with love. Maybe your partner constantly belittled you, and over time, their voice became your own inner dialogue. Or maybe you grew up in a family where conflict was the norm, and now peace feels foreign, even uncomfortable. The mind, conditioned to equate love with suffering, leads you to sabotage relationships that are healthy, choosing instead those that mirror old wounds. This, too, is a form of emotional self-harm, seeking familiarity and pain because healing feels unnatural. At the core of all this lies a deeper truth. Emotional self-harm is not an accident. It is a coping mechanism. The human mind seeks control, and when life feels overwhelming, we turn inward, using self-criticism or self-sabotage as a way to maintain some form of power. If I hurt myself first, the mind reasons, no one else can hurt me worse. This illusion of control is seductive, but it is also the very thing that keeps us stuck. Instead of protecting us, it reinforces our wounds, making healing feel more distant with each cycle. There is also a neurological piece to this puzzle. Every thought we repeat strengthens neural pathways in the brain. If we consistently practice self-criticism, those pathways become stronger, more automatic. The brain learns that negativity is the default mode. Breaking free, then, is not just about willpower. It's about retraining the brain, creating new pathways of self-compassion and acceptance. That's why emotional self-harm feels so difficult to escape. It's not only emotional, it's physical, wired into the very structure of the mind. But perhaps the most haunting truth is this: emotional self-harm often masquerades as responsibility. People convince themselves they are simply being realistic when they tear themselves down. They mistake harshness for honesty, believing that self-criticism is the only path to improvement. In reality, this approach rarely leads to growth. It leaves us paralyzed, fearful, and unwilling to take risks. True growth comes not from tearing ourselves apart, but from creating a safe inner environment where mistakes can exist without becoming proof of unworthiness. So where does emotional self-harm really come from? It comes from a convergence of childhood conditioning, cultural pressures, shame, toxic relationships, and the brain's own wiring. It is the perfect storm of internal and external forces, all whispering the same lie: you are not enough. And when we believe that lie, we turn it into action, harming ourselves in ways both subtle and obvious. But understanding the origin is only the first step. The deeper question becomes, how do we break free? How do we stop repeating the cycles that were handed down to us? Because make no mistake, cycles can be broken. But it requires courage, awareness, and the willingness to rewrite the inner story. Where emotional self-harm really comes from, Part 3. Healing from emotional self-harm doesn't begin with silencing the inner critic. It begins with understanding it. That voice inside, the one that tells you you're not enough, that sabotages your joy, that convinces you to settle for pain it was born to protect you once. It may sound harsh, but at its root, it developed as a survival strategy. When you recognize this, the fight shifts. Instead of waging war against yourself, you start to see that your mind was doing the best it could with the tools it had. And that realization is powerful. Because once you understand the purpose behind the pattern, you can begin to replace it with something healthier. The first step is awareness. Most of us move through life repeating thoughts without questioning them. I'll never succeed. I don't deserve love. I'm not good enough. These phrases roll off the tongue with such ease that they feel like facts. But they are not facts, they are stories. Stories that were written by past experiences, not by your present reality. Becoming aware of these stories, catching yourself in the act of self-harmful thinking, is like turning on a light in a dark room. You may not change the room instantly, but now you can see what's inside. The second step is compassion. And this is where many struggle. We are taught to be compassionate toward others, but rarely toward ourselves. Yet self-compassion is not weakness, it is medicine. When you make a mistake and your instinct is to lash out at yourself, pause and ask, would I say this to someone I love? If the answer is no, then it doesn't deserve to be said to yourself either. Compassion retrains the brain. It builds new pathways that replace harshness with patience, cruelty with kindness. The third step is breaking the cycle of comparison. This means becoming intentional with what you consume. Social media, television, even conversations with certain people, all of these shape the way we see ourselves. If your daily intake is filled with reminders of what you lack, then you are feeding the very cycle that harms you. But when you begin curating your environment, choosing to engage with voices that uplift rather than diminish, you starve that cycle of oxygen. Healing often starts with subtraction, removing the influences that keep you chained. And then comes courage. Healing from emotional self-harm requires the courage to enter unfamiliar territory. For many, peace feels uncomfortable. Kindness feels suspicious. Love feels unsafe. But courage means leaning into that discomfort, even when it feels unnatural. It means choosing to stay in healthy relationships, even when the old part of you screams to run. It means forgiving yourself for not knowing better before you learned how. Courage is the bridge between awareness and transformation. And finally, healing requires rewriting the story. Remember, emotional self-harm thrives on a narrative. I am not enough. To break it, you must create a new one. That doesn't mean standing in front of a mirror and repeating empty affirmations. It means embodying small, consistent acts of self-respect. It could be as simple as honoring your need for rest instead of pushing yourself past exhaustion. It could be setting a boundary in a relationship where you used to remain silent. Each act of self-respect is a sentence in your new story. Over time, those sentences accumulate, and a new truth begins to emerge. I am worthy of kindness, even from myself. It's important to remember that healing isn't linear. You won't wake up one day free of self-criticism forever. There will be setbacks. Old wounds will resurface. But progress is not about perfection. It's about persistence. Every time you notice the pattern and choose compassion over cruelty, you weaken the grip of emotional self-harm. Every time you honor yourself instead of sabotaging yourself, you reclaim a piece of your power. And this is the final truth. Emotional self-harm doesn't define you. It is not who you are, it is something you learned. And if it was learned, it can be unlearned. Your worth was never destroyed by the mistakes you made, by the love you didn't receive, or by the voices that told you otherwise. It has always been there, untouched, waiting for you to see it. So ask yourself now, are you ready to stop being your own enemy? Are you ready to rewrite the story, not because the world demands it, but because you deserve it? The moment you decide to step out of the cycle, you begin to transform. And slowly, day by day, you shift from a person who wounds themselves in silence to a person who nurtures themselves with intention. That is where resilience is born. That is where healing begins. And that is where you finally discover that you were enough all along.